Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host of the show and the content director at Word on Fire. And joining me, as he is every week, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Thank you, Brandon. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing really well. You know, we're all excited at Word on Fire as the launch date for Pivotal Players nears. I know for you especially, it has to be an exciting time.
It is. I mean, those are long processes. I've done now 2 of these major film series, and you realize, gosh, how much work is involved and how much time and effort and teamwork, you know. So when it finally is coming out, you have a great sense of satisfaction.
I've been mentioning it on each of the last few episodes, but again, please check it out. Go visit pivotalplayers.com. There's lots of sample videos up there. I think once you see just a minute or 2 of the clips, you're going to be blown away. So check it out. Make sure to pre-order your copy. It comes out on September 1st, and you'll be one of the first to see these magnificent episodes. Now, Bishop, you had a wonderful house guest there in Santa Barbara for the last week. He's one of my favorite spiritual writers. He contributes to the Word on Fire blog. He's written several great books. He is Father Paul Murray. So tell us a little bit about him and the time you had together.
Oh, yeah, Paul Murray is a great man, a great friend. We met, I think, first in the year 2000. He was a visiting scholar at Mundelein Seminary. Paul's an Irish Dominican. And he's been teaching for the past many, many years at the Angelicum in Rome. So he's come to know all kinds of people through that, but also he travels the world as a retreat master, as a speaker. He's also a very good writer, has written, I think, the most compelling things on the Dominican spiritual tradition. He's a great advocate of St. Thomas Aquinas, and so we have that very much in common. But we have been friends for a long time. Whenever I go to Rome, I always make a point of having dinner or lunch, maybe even a couple times with Paul. So I was thrilled. He's on a speaking tour, really, and a retreat tour of the United States. And he had a little hiatus in between obligations. So I said, why don't you come to Santa Barbara and you could just relax a little bit. So he was here for a good, I think it was 8 or 9 days. And we talked and went for walks, and he took in the beautiful sunshine here. But it's always a thrill to be with Paul.
Not to put a too fine a point on the Pivotal Players promotion, but for the study program that goes along with these films, we track down the leading experts on these 6 pivotal players, and we asked them to each write a lesson for the study guide. And the person that we got to write the study guide for St. Catherine of Siena, who was a Dominican, was Father Paul Murray, also a Dominican, who has a great admiration for Catherine.
Yeah, and I was thrilled that we got Paul for that, and some other really great people for the other study programs. Dale Alquist for G.K. Chesterton. We had Father Cantalamessa himself for St. Francis. So it was a wonderful thing, and I was delighted to get Paul for Catherine. And as I mentioned, Paul is one of the great, really connoisseurs of the Dominican spiritual tradition. So Aquinas, of course, and many others. But one of his favorites is Catherine of Siena. And Paul's written very powerfully about her. So I was delighted that he crafted the study program for us.
Well, today's episode is dedicated to a small, diminutive Albanian nun who is a large figure in the history of 20th century Catholic spirituality. We know her as Mother Theresa, but pretty soon here, the whole world's going to know her as Saint Teresa of Calcutta, because Pope Francis on September 4th is going to be canonizing Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. So she'll be forever known as Saint Teresa. I know, ironically, we're just talking about Father Paul Murray. He wrote a great book on Mother Teresa titled I Loved Jesus in the Night. So if you want a good introduction to her spirituality, check out that book. But let's spend some time talking about this newest saint of the church, Teresa of Calcutta. So first of all, Bishop, give us a little overview of who is Mother Teresa.
Yeah, as you say, one of the great figures of the 20th century. And the years I was coming of age, if you said, now, who's a living saint? Everyone would say Mother Teresa. She was just it. She was the person generally acknowledged to be the holiest person on the planet. And that's no small accomplishment, you know. Who was she? Well, as you mentioned, a nun from Albania, a woman from Albania. So a European. But very early on, she joins the Sisters of Loretto, and she's sent to Ireland for her basic, novitiate and training. That's how she came to learn English quite well. But then very early on, she becomes interested in the missions, especially to India. And so as a young nun, she goes to India and is wonderful excerpts in her letters and writings about her first experience of India, which, for anyone from the West is a kind of a shock to the senses. But she arrives there, and then she works for many years as a very good, very dedicated Loreto nun, doing work largely in education. And she finds herself, she's approaching midlife and in a very good situation, teaching in a, relatively well-to-do school. She's good woman, deeply admired. But on the way up to Darjeeling, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas, for a retreat, she has this extraordinary experience, which amounts to a call within the call, as she put it. So the great call to be a sister, to be a person of service. But then she heard the voice of the Lord saying, are you willing to serve the poorest of the poor? And she protested to her smallness, and the Lord said, that's why I want you. I know how small and I know how worthless you are. That's why I want to use you, and that becomes key to her spirituality. But she follows that call, and it was tested. It's a great part of her story, how that call was tested by very good people, spiritual directors, the local bishop, who wanted to make sure this was not just a extreme interest of hers. And they did test her, and finally they went to Rome, et cetera, and then she got permission to start what amounted to a new religious order. But I find so moving when she finally got the permission, and off she goes into the worst slum on the planet in the midst of Calcutta and begins to serve the poor. But almost immediately, she's joined by a lot of her former students. So these young women that she had taught, they saw what she was doing. They came to her. And that's the core of what came to be called the Missionaries of Charity. And so Mother Teresa's order begins in Calcutta and grows in that city for some time, and then makes a tentative move outside of Calcutta to other places in India, and then begins the move around the world. One of the turning points was the visit of Malcolm Muggeridge. So this great English journalist who had been kind of a hard-bitten, cynical writer, and then himself underwent a sort of conversion. He comes to Calcutta to film Mother Teresa and to write about her. And this film and book, Something Beautiful for God, came out of that. And that's how she became known to the wider world. I remember reading that book when I was in college, would have been in late 1970s. I think it came out in the early 70s. But it's a book that just anyone that reads it is moved by it. And the film is very powerful that Muggeridge put together. So that kind of put her on the map, you want it globally. And then her order really took off because it fascinated people all over the world. And her nuns now, they started to go to Africa, to Europe, to North America, South America, and now they cover the whole world. She wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and that brings her again to a very, broad world stage. And then during those years, she emerges, as I say, as, the sort of model of sanctity. Pope John Paul II embraced her as a great model of what he meant by, the new evangelization and the revival of the Catholic faith. She dies in 1997, and I always find it interesting that she died right after Princess Diana died in the car crash in Paris. Then Mother Teresa died just a few weeks later. I remember giving a homily after her death about the two most famous women in the world. I think that's undoubtedly true at the time. The two most famous women in the world died within a few weeks of each other. Very different women, but who knew each other. Anyway, so she dies in 1997, and now we find almost 20 years later, she's about to be canonized.
One of the things that's always struck me about Mother Teresa is how well integrated she was as a Catholic. You've described that in our culture, and specifically in the Catholic culture, we're so bifurcated. You have the so-called social justice Catholics in one area, the so-called pro-life Catholics or the liturgically minded Catholics, all these different groups whereas people like Mother Teresa blended all these things together in the great both and of faith. She reminds me in that way of people like Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati or Dorothy Day, people who got their hands dirty, who were gritty and carried out the works of mercy, but also had profound spiritual lives as well. So would you say Mother Teresa is maybe the both and saint par excellence, to use your words?
Yeah, I think you're right. And the connection to Dorothy Day is an important one. There's a famous photograph, lovely photograph of a visit that Mother Teresa made to Dorothy Day. And these two women who embodied so much of the best of Catholicism in the 20th century. And yes, they have that in common. Nobody was more devoted to the smell of a sheep, than Mother Teresa. Nobody was more involved in a gritty, hands-on, work with the poor. At the same time, she spends hours a day in prayer and at the Mass and benediction and retreats. Mother Teresa had very little time for priests who were loosey-goosey about doctrine. There are many stories about she'd invite a priest to come in to speak to her sisters, and if Mother was not pleased with the talk, she would thank the priest and then quietly tell him, "Okay, that's enough. I don't want you to speak anymore to the sisters." So my point there is prayer, doctrine, devotion, all of that was as important, indeed more important for her than work with the poor. It was all of a piece. It was all integrated. And yes, I think after the council, those elements tended to disintegrate, and that's been bad for the whole church.
In her writings, you often see her correlate the Eucharist to her work with the poor. And she would say things like, I visit Jesus in the mornings in the Eucharist, and then in the afternoons I go meet him on the street in the poor. Talk about that connection between the sacramental life and the works of mercy.
Yeah, all the saints see that, don't they? The great saints. The more you're in love with Jesus, the more you're in love with the Eucharist. The more you're in love with the Eucharist, the more you're in love with the body of Christ in all of its dimensions. So the Eucharist is the body of Christ, really, truly, and substantially present under sacramental signs. The mystical body of Jesus is the church. And so how many of the saints, when they're greeting a visitor, when they're serving the poor, will even say to themselves, I'm going to serve the Lord, or I want to go welcome the Lord. She had that in her bones. It was, again, part of the integrated Catholic vision. Don't drive wedges and say that, no, I'm a Eucharistic, sacramental, liturgical person, and you're a social justice person. No, we're both preoccupied, if you want, with the body of Christ in its various forms and manifestations. She got that, I think, very deeply, as did John Paul II, all the great saints. I've said over the years, one thing all the saints have in common is a love for the Eucharist. The saints could be as different as anything, and they are. But across the ages, across the cultures, the one thing they absolutely have in common is a love for the Eucharist. Well, if you're really in love with the Eucharist, then you're in love with the mystical body of Jesus, especially in the poor. So all that to me is of a piece.
Now, we didn't know this until after Mother Teresa died and some of her personal writings were uncovered and shared, but it appears that she experienced some sort of dark night of the soul. Now, that it's been interpreted all sorts of ways. I remember the atheist Christopher Hitchens claiming that Mother Teresa was in fact an atheist and she was doubting that God even exists. Others said that it was just her experience of personal suffering. Maybe she had some personal emotional issues, maybe even some psychological issues. What do you make of this dark night of the soul? What is that, and how did it affect Mother Teresa?
It's one of the most fascinating things, I think, in 20th century spirituality. And as you say, we only learned about it in relatively recent years. So all the years I was coming of age, and here Mother Teresa, everyone assumed she was this, radiantly joyful person and had a very deep connection to the Lord. No one saw, except for a few of her spiritual counselors and directors, saw this dimension. Now, what is it? It's complicated. It's hard to get a handle on. She herself will say these very strong, almost extreme things about sensing the absence of God. I put it that way. Sensing the absence of God. Mind you, that's not the same as denying the existence of God. That's what an atheist would do. But Mother sensed very deeply the absence of God. Now, here's someone who, as a young woman, felt so intimately the presence of Jesus that she heard his voice. She heard his voice telling her what he wanted her to do, which made, I think, it so much more painful that then over all these decades, she didn't feel or sense the presence of God. Did she disbelieve in God? Absolutely not. I mean, every little detail of her life would militate against that conclusion. So what's going on? I'll just say two simple things, and it's a deeply complicated issue. One is, and here's Father Paul Murray's take on it. Paul, by the way, who knew her quite well, it's not so much the absence of light, but the excess of light that produced the darkness. So you know what I mean? Darkness can be produced by the sun going down, the absence of light. Or there's so much light that it overwhelms my faculties. I'm blinded, as it were, by excess of light. So Paul's theory, and you find it in the spiritual tradition, is as God gets closer to us, we get closer to God, our faculties of receptivity are overwhelmed to the point that it feels as though God isn't there, when in fact, he's massively there. And it's the massive proximity of God that's causing this darkness. Okay, that's one take on it. Here's a second one that I tend to gravitate toward this. This felt absence of God, again, which is not the denial of God. They're qualitatively different moves. This felt absence of God is a participation in Calvary, in the suffering and dying of Jesus. That the Son of God felt the absence of God is part of the salvific process, right? So that, as Balthasar would say, the Son is pushed to the limits of God-forsakenness. He becomes sin on the cross, as Paul put it. Not a sinner, but he utterly participates in the alienation and negativity of sin. He feels the absence of God. I think that's something that a lot of the saints experience, including Mother Teresa. I'll tell you someone else who experienced it is Mother Teresa's spiritual hero and namesake, Teresa of Lisieux. Remember, at the very end of her life, her short life, as Teresa is dying, she talks about this, the sense of the absence of God, the sense of the darkness. And she interpreted it, I think quite rightly, as an identification with those who feel alienated from God. And she becomes thereby, she dies in 97, so just at the end of the 19th century. But she anticipates so many people in the 20th century who would also sense and feel the absence of God. I think Mother Teresa, now who dies precisely 100 years later in 1997, her namesake, if you want these two women that bookend the 20th century, both deeply in love with the Lord Jesus and both deeply felt the absence of God. I think that's a very telling thing as God, see, God's saints are like works of art, you know? And so these two great works of art, the little flower, Thérèse, and then Teresa, who took her name explicitly from Thérèse, these two book-ending works of art that identify with the suffering, a particular form of suffering in the 20th century.
For a deeper exploration of Mother Teresa's Dark Night, I know the bishop and I would both highly recommend the book we've mentioned a couple times by Father Paul Murray called I Loved Jesus in the Night. Father Paul knew Mother Teresa and has read through all of her private writings, and so he offers a great take on what was going on there. So check that book out. Now, Bishop, while filming the Catholicism series some years ago, you featured Mother Teresa pretty heavily, and that involved traveling to Calcutta to do some filming. What do you remember from those experiences? What did you take away from Calcutta?
Oh my gosh, yeah, it was unforgettable. Let me say this bluntly, it was the worst place I've ever been in my life, by which I mean the city of Calcutta has such overwhelming poverty and overwhelming degradation. You know, many parts of Calcutta, not every part, but many parts are like walking through a garbage dump. That's what it felt like. You're just walking through this endless garbage dump. But living in the garbage dump are all kinds of people. Living in cardboard boxes, living on the street, living on the sidewalk, you know. So there's something that's shocking about it. And then, as everyone says, as my first time to India, the way it overwhelms the senses, you know, the sights you're taking in, the smells you're taking in, the sounds you're taking in, overwhelming. And then to go, I remember we got this van that drove us to Mother Teresa's, the Mother House. It's in like the worst part of the worst slum in the world. What I remember, though, are the radiantly joyful faces of the nuns, who are, again, in the worst, I can't imagine a worse place on the planet Earth to be. And they're working with people who are dying and sick and diseased and covered in flies. And there they are, radiantly joyful. That's a miracle of grace. And that's what I remember most vividly from it. Yes, the sights and sounds and smells and the kind of horrific quality of it. But it's the smiles of the nuns that stay in my mind. And then visiting Mother Teresa's cell, which, of course, they preserved. And it's this little tiny place, couple of sticks of furniture. It was like a picnic table, sort of pushed over in the corner. I guess that's where she had her meals or what. But the one decoration in it is a photograph of Teresa of Lisieux. And I found that extremely moving to think of this, kind of bourgeois French nun from the late 19th century, from a sort of upper middle class family, a little pampered girl. And yet her spirituality was so profound that it massively influenced the most famous and grittiest saint of the 20th century. So the continuity of providence, of grace, all that, that stays in my mind.
Peter Kraft once said that if you want to be a saint, read the writings of John Paul II and Mother Teresa and then do everything they say. What do you think about that strategy? And in particular, Mother Teresa is often depicted as sort of this exclusively focused on social justice and the corporal works of mercy. What do you think about her as a spiritual master? How do you account for her spiritual writings?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with Peter Kraft. That's pretty good. It reminds you of Mary, saying to the servants, do whatever he tells you, so that's the key to the spiritual life. And these figures, John Paul and Mother Teresa, so participated in that. I mean, that's what they did. They try to do whatever he tells you. So that's not bad. So then we should do whatever they tell us. That's not a bad way to do it. The key to Mother Teresa's spirituality is, as I suggested, Therese. So Mother Teresa is maybe most famous for this statement. Don't worry about doing great things, but do little things with great love. I preached that 2 days ago here in California. I mention that line all the time because it's key to the spiritual life. I mean, don't worry about doing great things, because great things, according to whom? On whose eyes? The world. So the world holds up all kinds of things. So what? So what? I mean, it means nothing. But do little things, which anyone can do all the time, with great love. Now you're on the spiritual. And that's not twee sentimentality. It's not. It's hard-edged spiritual talk. Don't worry about doing great things, because the world is full of people that they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what's worth honoring. Don't worry about that. Do the smallest thing with great love, and you're on the beam of God. Now, where did Mother Teresa get that from? She got it from Teresa of Lisieux. That's an encapsulation of the little way, right? Which also is not twee and sentimental. The little way, The little way is that. It's don't worry about doing great things. Therese in her convent in Lisieux is a great saint. And she did nothing great in the eyes of the world. Absolutely nothing. But little things with great love, that's what it's all about. So that's the key to Mother Teresa's spirituality. And it brings us back to the little flower.
Well, it's time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we would love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question there on any device. And every episode we pick one to air here on the show. Today we have a great question from Jessica, who asks about a topic very familiar to Mother Teresa. It involves offering up your sufferings in service of God. So here's Jessica.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Jessica. I live in Oregon, and I'm a relatively new Catholic. And my question is, I keep hearing about people saying offering up your suffering or uniting your suffering with Jesus on the cross. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that means and why you would do that and how I could learn more about it. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question, a very searching one. And you're getting close to the heart of the spiritual life. Remember when Paul says mysteriously that we make up in our own sufferings what's still lacking in the sufferings of Christ? And you say, well, now, what does that mean? I mean, as though there's still something missing, the cross wasn't enough, we're not really saved. Well, no, it doesn't mean that. What it means is the church, which is the mystical body, is the prolongation of the incarnation across space and time. That's what the church fathers saw. So in the mystical body, what happens is Jesus continues to live his life, but now in us. So he lived it in this absolutely full sense in his historical body in Palestine 2,000 years ago, but he continues to live it in us, in his mystical body, which means he's going to live the whole of it. Will he be preaching? Yeah. And that's why, I'd say, I hope humbly enough, Word on Fire in its own small way is Jesus still preaching, Does he still heal? Yeah. And so think of the church's whole ministry of healing. Does he still reach out to the poor? Yeah. Look at Mother Teresa, etc. Okay. Well, what else did Jesus do? Well, he suffers. That was essential to salvation, that he suffered on the cross. What does it mean, therefore, to say Jesus continues to live his life in us? It means we suffer. But now watch, our suffering, therefore, is not just dumb suffering. Ugh, this terrible thing I'm enduring. No, joined consciously to the suffering of Christ, it becomes a means of salvation. It becomes a vehicle by which Jesus continues to effect his salvation in the world. Now I'll get back to your question about suffering on behalf of others, offering up your suffering for somebody else in the mystical body. That's how it works, For the details, I'd read someone like Charles Williams and his stuff on co-inherence, right? That we all exist in and for each other. And Williams said, even though it's the exact dynamics of it might remain mysterious, that you can make that conscious move. And you can say, Lord, please take this suffering of mine and use it to alleviate the suffering of somebody else in the mystical body. Which, by the way, if you think that sounds funny, parents do it all the time, don't they? Parents who will, as it were, take on the suffering of their kids to alleviate their pain. Does the same thing obtain within the mystical body? Yes. Yes, all the saints witness to it. So that's a quick answer to your very searching question.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. We're all very excited about the new canonization of Mother Teresa, which will happen here in just a few days. And again, we're almost as excited about the release of our new film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Player. So again, be sure to visit pivotalplayers.com to watch some exclusive video trailers and previews and behind-the-scenes footage as well, and then pick up your copy there as well. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.